Hey everyone, welcome to this explainer. If you are gearing up for your A-level history exams and want an absolute deep dive, you are in exactly the right place. Today, we're going to frame 60 years of British economic history as a massive, super complex engine, an engine that a whole succession of prime ministers desperately tried to fix, often using completely different instruction manuals. From the ashes of World War I right up to the dawn of Thatcherism, we are going to map out every single key policy, crisis, and turning point you need to know. Let's get into it. So here's our roadmap for tracking this giant pendulum swing of economic philosophy. We're hitting the WWI fallout and the 1930s, the WW2 command economy, post-war austerity, stop-go economics, and finally the wild 1970s inflation crisis. All right, starting off with Section 1, World War I fallout and the 1930s, or as we like to call it, the shattered free market. Imagine going into the 20th century as a global trading titan, only to emerge from the First World War with unexpected, deep structural damage. £3.25 billion. That staggering number represents the total financial cost of the conflict for Britain. It drained so much capital that the government literally had to borrow massive sums from American banks just to keep the lights on. The data from that era paints a brutal picture. That £3.25 billion cost totally crippled the nation. By 1920, the national debt had ballooned to £8 billion. And to pay for all that, income taxes were hiked from a very modest 5% up to a punishing 25%. Meanwhile, exports completely tanked. German U-boats had sunk 40% of British merchant shipping, and traditional markets had been swallowed up by foreign competitors. So Britain was still importing at pre-war levels, but simply wasn't exporting nearly enough to foot the bill. So what do? Well, this sparked literally the fiercest economic debate of the interwar years over how to save failing industries like coal and cotton. It was a massive political tug-of-war. On one side, you had free trade. Do you keep consumer prices low but risk bankrupting your own domestic businesses? On the other side, protectionism. Do you slap tariffs on foreign goods to protect British jobs, knowing it'll make everyday goods more expensive for people? Right in the middle of this intense debate, Chancellor Winston Churchill makes what many economists today view as a colossal misstep. In 1925, he reintroduced the gold standard. This fixed the pound artificially high. The results? It made British exports devastatingly expensive on the global market, and it forced the Bank of England to keep interest rates sky high, completely starving British businesses of the cheap borrowing they desperately needed to modernize. Now for your A-levels, this is the crucial turning point to remember. Recovery really only kicked in after 1931, when Britain was finally forced to abandon the gold standard. Unchaining the pound let it drop to a much more competitive level, making exports cheaper. But maybe more importantly, it meant interest rates could finally be cut. That cheap borrowing sparked a massive housing boom, especially in the Southeast and the Midlands, which helped drive unemployment all the way down from 17% to 8.5% by the late 1930s. Moving right along to Section 2, the WW2 command economy. This is where the state takes the wheel. When conflict erupted again in 1939, that fragile free market we just talked about, completely gone. It was replaced by radical, total state intervention. Production wasn't about consumer demand anymore. It was dictated by newly created government ministries. It became an absolute command economy. By 1941, military spending was eating up an astonishing 53% of Britain's entire GDP. And the results of this shift were absolutely massive. It really highlights the sheer efficacy of central control when it's managed well. Take the desperate days of the Battle of Britain. Lord Beaverbrook was appointed to head the Ministry of Aircraft Production, and output absolutely skyrocketed. We're talking a jump from 638 planes to 1,375 in just 4 months. For a lot of people, this proved that when the state takes control, immense productivity is entirely possible. Okay, Section 3, Nationalization and Post-War Austerity. After the war, Clement Attlee's new Labour government definitely didn't forget those wartime lessons of state intervention. Even though Britain ended the war effectively bankrupt, literally owing £2 billion to the USA, the government chose to spend another $2 billion buying out private shareholders. They went on a spree, systematically nationalizing coal, rail, electricity, and steel. Their main goal? To guarantee full employment and centrally manage any economic downturns, regardless of the immediate financial hit. But there was a massive catch. Britain's grand domestic ambitions were fighting a losing battle against its international ambitions.
because Britain insisted on keeping up an expensive global military presence, stationing troops in Germany, fighting in Korea, Malaya, and Kenya. Its domestic investment totally lagged. Britain put only 9% of its GDP into its own infrastructure. Compare that to 20% in a defeated Germany. This critically handicapped British industry, putting it at a long-term competitive disadvantage that would soon become impossible to ignore.
Which brings us to Section 4, Consensus and Stop-Go Economics. Going into the 1950s and 60s, a fascinating political consensus took hold to maintain this mixed economy. But, and you absolutely need to memorize this exact sequence for your exams, the way they managed it was through the notorious stop-go cycle. Here's how it worked. The government would try to boost living standards by relaxing consumer credit. That's the go. But people would use that easy money to buy foreign imports, which caused balance of payments issues and spiked inflation. Panicking, the government would then crank up interest rates to slow things down. That's the stop. And that would inevitably trigger a recession. It was just an incredibly jerky, stressful way to drive an economy.
Yet, even with that jerky steering, the 1950s felt like an absolute golden age for a lot of folks. Prime Minister Harold Macmillan captured the buzz of this consumer boom perfectly with his famous quote, "People finally had televisions, washing machines, their own cars." But behind closed doors, Macmillan secretly knew this consumer-driven growth was totally unbalanced and that rising inflation was a deeply dangerous consequence.
And contrasting Macmillan's public optimism, there was some serious underlying rot. Sure, living standards at home were rising, but on the global stage, Britain's actual economic growth was being dwarfed. By 1960, Japan was seeing explosive growth of 12%, while Britain was limping along at just 4%. The British economic engine was definitely running, but it was losing the global race. To try and patch this up, Macmillan, and later Labour's Harold Wilson, gave something called corporatism a shot. The idea was simple: get the government, trade unions, and business bosses into a room to plan the economy together. They even set up advisory councils with these incredibly catchy acronyms like NEDI and NICI. Unfortunately, these councils had pretty much no legal teeth, and the trade unions, who were really enjoying the consumer boom, largely ignored their pleas for voluntary wage restraint. And that brings us to our final act, Section 5, the 1970s inflation crisis, where the consensus collapses. Things completely fell apart in the 70s. The post-war consensus spectacularly collapsed under the weight of global shocks and bitter strikes. The nightmare of this era is summed up by one terrifying number: 30%. By 1975, inflation had skyrocketed to over 30%. Just imagine the cost of your groceries going up by a third in a single year. It completely wiped out workers' wages, leading to massive industrial unrest as unions demanded huge pay rises just to survive, which, as you can guess, only fueled even more inflation. The whole thing climaxed in 1976. International confidence vanished. The pound slumped, the country was drowning in £8 billion of debt, and Labour Chancellor Dennis Healey had to literally fly to the International Monetary Fund for a £3 billion bailout. The catch? The IMF demanded £3 billion in severe public spending cuts in return. It was seen by many as a total national humiliation. The left wing of Healey's own party, led by figures like Tony Benn, who wanted a protectionist siege economy, furiously denounced Healey, saying he was betraying working-class values. Out of this sheer chaos, a radically different playbook emerged, heavily championed by thinkers like Keith Joseph and eventually Margaret Thatcher. This was monetarism. Monetarists argued that the whole post-war obsession with printing money to guarantee full employment was a fundamental mistake. They believed that inflation, not unemployment, was the true enemy, and that the government had to strictly control the money supply and let free markets dictate jobs and wages. So here is your complete 60-year pendulum swing. In a massive watershed moment, Labour Prime Minister James Callaghan stood before his party and frankly admitted that you could no longer just spend your way out of a recession. This remarkable admission signaled the definitive death of the post-war Keynesian consensus. The stage was now completely set for the birth of the free market, neoliberal era that would come to dominate the 1980s. Which leaves us with this final massive question for you to analyze and debate in your A-level essays. After 60 years of trying literally every economic manual available, from the free trade of the 20s to the total command of WWI to the stop-go consensus, all the way to the harsh medicine of the IMF, what was truly responsible for Britain's long-term decline? Was it too much government meddling, or was Britain simply battered by unavoidable global forces? Think carefully about the history we've mapped out today. Thank you so much for joining this explainer, and best of luck with your revision.